If the rabble were lopped off at one end and the aristocrat at the other, all would be well with the country.
Andrew Johnson was born into poverty on December 29, 1808, in Raleigh, North Carolina. The son of a janitor and a weaver, Johnson never attended school. Instead, he and his brother became apprenticed to the town's tailor. At age 17, Johnson relocated to Greenville, Tennessee. On the way into town, Johnson was said to have caught the eye of 15-year-old Eliza McCardle. "There goes my beau," she exclaimed, as Johnson passed by her as he walked into town. They were married the following year. Johnson's tailor shop, where his wife would sometimes read aloud to him, evolved into the local political meeting ground. First an alderman and then the mayor, Johnson was soon serving in the Tennessee State House. He was said to have been a great stump speaker and a champion of the working class. He was also strongly opposed to secession. As a United States Senator in 1857, he proclaimed,
"I love the Constitution. The Union shall be saved, as old Hickory Jackson did in 1832.
His desire to preserve the Union infuriated many Southerners. Johnson received several death threats during his re-election campaign for governor. Once, before addressing a crowd, he drew a pistol from his coat, laid it before him on a table, and said,
I have been informed that part of the business to be transacted on the present occasion is the assassination of the individual who now has the honor of addressing you. If any man has come here today for the business indicated, let him shoot."
At the Republican convention in June of 1864, President Lincoln replaced his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, with the pro-Union Southern Democrat, Andrew Johnson. Prior to the inaugural ceremony in March of 1865, Johnson, who had been ill and felt weak, drank some whiskey to reinvigorate himself. He ended up delivering an incoherent speech that led many to believe he had a drinking problem. Lincoln later defended him.
"I have known Andy a great many years, and he ain't no drunkard."
Johnson was convinced his vice presidential speech had ruined his political future. Lincoln's death at 7:30 a.m. on April 15, 1865, however, changed that. President Johnson's first order of business was a cross-country train tour, in which he unsuccessfully tried to rally support of Lincoln's lenient plan for Reconstruction of the South. Historians have written that his greatest achievement while in office was the acquisition of Alaska from Russia. But Johnson's devotion to the Constitution and Reconstruction seemed to overshadow this and other issues. The radical Republicans in Congress were not willing to negotiate with him and were constantly attempting to strip him of power. When Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, forbidding Johnson from replacing his cabinet members without permission of the Senate, he defied the members and fired the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, a radical Republican sympathizer. Based on this incident, the House voted to impeach the president. He was acquitted by one vote in the Senate. Following his term, Johnson was denied renomination and returned amid great pomp and circumstance to Greenville. He remained active in politics and in 1874 became the first and only former president to be elected to the United States Senate. He died in office only a few months later. In a memo found after his death, he wrote,
"I have performed my duty to God, my country, and my family. I have nothing to fear in approaching death. To me, it is the mere shadow of God's protecting wing."
Welcome to the 17th stop in our American President series. Today we're in Greenville, Tennessee, in the eastern part of the state, not far from the Great Smoky and Appalachian Mountains. We're visiting the home of Andrew Johnson, who lived here with his wife Eliza, starting in 1851 until his death in 1875. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's new vice president, and just about 1 month after the inauguration, with Lincoln's assassination, he became our 17th president. Today, we learn about the life and times of Andrew Johnson of Greenville, Tennessee. Here's our lineup. Throughout our program this morning, you will be hearing from Michael Les Benedict, a history professor at Ohio State University and author of 2 books about this period in American history, one on Johnson's impeachment and another on Reconstruction in the South. You'll also meet Jim Small, who is Chief of Operations here at the Johnson National Historic Site. By telephone, we'll talk to Johnson's great-great-great-granddaughter. Her name is Corinne Null. And you'll meet Dr. Robert Orr, a local historian who will tell us about Johnson as a native son of East Tennessee. The important thing about these live programs is your participation. Please join in our history dialogue. Here are the phone numbers. Eastern and Central Time Zones 202-624-1111. Mountain and Pacific Time Zone viewers should call in 202-624-1115. We are live from the garden outside Andrew Johnson's home, and you're going to meet Les Benedict, who is our guest for most of our program this morning. The stage, as Johnson is sworn in, a country torn apart by war, great debts in the South, the president martyred, trying to put the country back together. Tell us about this man suddenly thrust into a leadership role. What kind of skills did he bring?
Well, what Johnson brought was a terrific sense of knowing that the way to restore the country was to follow what he thought was the constitutional requirements. He had an idea about the Civil War. He was convinced that the southern states really had never left the Union, that only their governments had committed treason, that a quick restoration of authority to new people running those governments was what was really essential, and that the rest of restoration was going to have to take a kind of political solution where the right people would be elected to take control of the southern governments and restore loyalty. And that really meant people who had not wanted to secede, even if they had supported the South in the end, who hadn't wanted to. And that's what he hoped to do, transfer that power in the South.
But on top of everything else, he was a president without a party. Lincoln, a Republican, had chosen a pro-union Democrat. The Congress had Republicans in control. Where was the constituency to follow this plan?
Well, actually, Johnson was a man without a party, but he was a very, very strong man. Lincoln didn't choose him to be vice president for nothing. He chose him to be vice president because Johnson stood for something. Johnson stood for all those Southerners, those white Southerners, who had not wanted to secede, whose voices had been stilled at the time of the secession, or some of whom had been carried away, mistakenly, Johnson thought, by the excitement and enthusiasm. He was the living representative of those people, and each party, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, wanted those people's support. So he had an independent strength that he thought gave him great strength within either party, or, if necessary, to create his own party.
He was also a man with no formal education.
That's right.
What effect might that have coming into a Congress full of what kind of people at the time?
Well, he came into a Congress that was overwhelmingly Republican. Southerners had no representatives in the Congress, of course, because they had left the Union. He was an uneducated man formally, but he had done a lot of reading. He had, of course, had a great career of service. But it is true that the kinds of arts that might be necessary, of having a broad understanding of other people and where they came from, and a willingness to compromise, and a recognition that there might be different ways to do things correctly, that he would prove to have trouble with. He had a kind of narrow mind, a fixed mind. When he knew something, he knew it.
Also, most biographies describe him as a really effective stump politician. What's that mean?
Well, it has to do with how you politicked in those days. Those were the days before television, before radio, even before a really wide popular press. There were local newspapers everywhere. And the way that you campaigned was primarily to get in front of the people, to let them see you and see what kind of a person you were, and to debate your opponents. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates were not unusual. They were typical. Each candidate would travel around the state with the other candidate, arguing with each other, debating, making points, trying to put a good face forward. He was wonderful at it. Most people who saw him thought that they had never seen anybody better at bringing the crowd in, at making himself one of them, at making them laugh, at making them cry when it was the right place, getting their heads nodding in agreement, and then just finishing it off.
We are at the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. This home here is one that Johnson built as an adult later on when he's a little more successful, and we're going to show you some of the scenes inside of that today and around the grounds. But this property and several others in Greenville are all managed by the National Park Service as part of the Johnson National Historic Site. And you will see as we progress during our program the tailor shop that really got him his start in politics, and his early home, his birthplace, and other sites associated with our 17th president. Let's begin our dialogue with you. First call of the morning on Andrew Johnson is from Morgantown, West Virginia. You're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a question. How would Mr. Benedict characterize the controversial Edwin M. Stanton in his dealings with Andrew Johnson? Was he trustworthy or self-serving or just a pawn of the radical Republicans?
All right, thanks. Appreciate it. Let's set the stage. The cabinet was one he inherited from Abraham Lincoln. Stanton, a member of the cabinet, what position?
Stanton was the Secretary of War. And was probably the cabinet member that Lincoln came to rely on more than any other of his cabinet. Johnson inherited Lincoln's cabinet and maintained it, continued with that cabinet in office until he broke with the Republican Party when about half the cabinet left. Stanton was uncertain what to do under those circumstances. He was generally sympathetic to Andrew Johnson. He himself was in the past a Democrat. He agreed to a certain extent with Johnson's programs. He also was concerned that Johnson was being too conciliatory and too soft with the South, and that he was alienating the Republican Party. And he didn't leave. He thought about leaving, but he didn't. All sorts of people told him to stay, to remain a bridge between Johnson and the Republicans if possible, and also to be a buffer between both sides and the Army. This was, after all, after a civil war. People were worried about violence, and people wanted to make sure that there was a strong character in charge of the Army, and Stanton was an extremely strong man.
Were there still any insurrections, armed insurrections, happening anywhere in the country?
No, but one of the surprising things about the Civil War was how quickly the Southerners laid down their arms once their major generals surrendered. Lincoln had been worried about a possible guerrilla war, but there never was one. So the real issue was how you were going to restore the country in a peaceful environment.
Next call, East Lansing, Michigan. You're on the air.
Hello, am I in the air?
You are. Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, let me say I really dig C-SPAN a lot. Yeah, I dropped out of high school. Then I went back and got my GED, and I went to my local community college, and I took some history classes, and I really started liking history, and I did so well, I got like straight A's. And one of the things that, I don't know what was it, I just began to warm to the subject, and we discussed Andrew Johnson in our American history section, and I was surprised to learn that he was kind of a buffoon. One time our history professor told us that a heckler heckled him from the audience, and he actually got down and started fighting the guy in a fist fight. And you begin to learn about some of these men and women from history, and they had feet of clay. You know, you think they're really icons, and in a way I guess they were, but... And also, I was really intrigued to learn how historians gather evidence and how they differ on a historical event. You know, just like economists, you can't get economists to agree on one thing. Well, historians can take, you know, the same event and historical event like the causes of the Civil War, let's say, and they all might disagree on things and how they interpret different historical events. And I really like your, you know, as a former dropout and stuff, I just want to tell fellow dropouts out there, you can, you know, like warm up to subjects and you can go back to school and stuff like that. And
well, thank you for that call. What are you doing when you're learning about all the conflicting opinions? Are you beginning to synthesize and develop your own opinions about things?
Precisely. And I also learned that you got to look at things in the context of that time and stuff, you know. I mean, I happen to be a black person, and I listen to these callers so-called African Americans, although I really like the term American myself, and they get really caught up in this slave thing, and abominable as slavery and all that kind of stuff was, and it was, no doubt, and we still are dealing with the effects of it today. You got to learn, I had learned that you look at things in the day in which these folks were dealing with, in the times and eras that they were in, and yes, that's exactly right. You begin to develop your own understanding of things, and I just really enjoy history, and American history in particular. It's so interesting, and the biographies of historical people and so on. Again, C-SPAN, please keep up the good work. I love everything you're doing, and let me hang up the phone now and listen.
Thank you very much for that telephone call, and also must warm the heart of a longtime history professor
Absolutely.
to see someone get excited about the subject.
Sounds like a good historian. Johnson as a buffoon. Well, you know, Johnson, just as the caller, I think, indicated, is a very controversial person. Historians disagree about Andrew Johnson, what he was like and what his legacy was like. I don't think it's fair to say that he was a buffoon. He was somebody, though, as we've just pointed out, who did get his start on the stump. He was a stump speaker. He was an energetic speaker. He made jokes. He criticized his opponents. He criticized them bitterly. He had great invective. One of his observers once said that a Johnson speech was salty and peppery and full of spice and full of heat. The problem was that when Johnson was president, he decided to try to build up support for himself by going out and making the same kind of stump speech nationally that he had done in Tennessee. And that wasn't the custom of the time. And people really didn't understand it. And when he went out and did it, he didn't look dignified. He didn't look like a president. I don't think he ever got off the podium and actually started to fight anybody, but he did get into arguments with people who were in that audience. The President of the United States arguing with somebody in the audience. Imagine how that looked to people. And so it did make him look somehow not respectable as president at the very time that he wanted to look most respectable as president.
Before our next call, please spend a little bit of time explaining Johnson's position on slavery.
Well, everybody in the slave states in the South, with only the rarest exceptions, supported slavery. That is the right of Southerners to hold slaves. Most of them, even by the 1850s and 1860s, were able to convince themselves that slavery was a good thing. Johnson was one of those, but he lived in an area of Tennessee, right around here, the hill country, where there were very few slaves. And the slaves that were here tended to be household servants or just one or two people on a farm. It wasn't plantation slavery. And the community in which he lived perceived itself as being disadvantaged in the state of Tennessee because the other parts of the state where there were much larger plantations seemed to get more and run things more. And he resented that, and his community resented that. So he had a mixed feeling about slave owners, about the way that the slave power was exercised, but he always supported slavery until the Civil War.
And he himself had some slaves here in this homestead. We'll learn a little bit more about that from Jim Small later in the program, about how many and how he treated these people and when he gave them their freedom. Also, just one note, I read that he managed to convince Abraham Lincoln to exempt Tennessee from the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's right. When Lincoln was beginning to move towards an Emancipation Proclamation, Johnson, of course, knew about it. Johnson was military governor of Tennessee, and it was his job to try to win back the loyalty of the people of Tennessee. He had a disadvantage because his own area, eastern Tennessee, around here, was still occupied by Confederate troops. So he had to win back the loyalty of people where there were a lot of slaves and a lot of slave owners and a lot of support for the Confederacy. He didn't think he could do that if those people at the same time were being told they had to give up their slaves. So he got Lincoln to exclude Tennessee from the proclamation, but then rather quickly he changed his mind, and therefore he had the gratification ultimately of making an Emancipation Proclamation for Tennessee himself.
Boston, welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my call. First, I'd like to thank C-SPAN as a future historian. Your programs, especially the American President series, have helped really supplement me in my pursuit of knowledge of American history. My first question is, who and what were the radical Republicans? Were they the same group of people as the Free Soilers? And how important was black suffragette to them? Like the last caller, I'm an African-American male too. I'm 32, so I'm a little bit an older student, older adult student. What was some of the legislation that President Johnson vetoed that radical Republicans submitted? And is it true that the number of Supreme Court justices was lowered during at the beginning of his presidency in some attempt to cause him political stress? And last, I heard he was a Jacksonian Democrat, and that usually meant that they viewed the Constitution very strictly, but yet he tried to say he was a person of the common folk. I don't understand how he could be both. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lots of big questions.
Lots of big questions.
Let me walk you through. The first was who were the radical Republicans, and what are some of their legislation that Johnson vetoed?
The radical Republicans were that part of the Republican Party during the Civil War and after, who were during the Civil War, urging Lincoln to take clear steps against slavery. Lincoln was a little reluctant to do that at first because he wanted to keep the North absolutely united, and he wanted to keep the border states where there still was slavery firmly supporting the North. So he only slowly came to the conclusion that in fact the right thing to do was to attack slavery directly. So those radicals were critical of him until he began to do that. When the war was over, those same radicals wanted to take steps to make sure that African Americans, after they were freed, would have basic rights, that they would be free of real oppression and actually have the kinds of freedoms that a free person ought to have. And some of them went so far as to say that the only way that you could guarantee that was to let these people have a share of political power by voting. And the people who took that position were definitely considered the radical Republicans. And most radical Republicans took that position, and they made up about perhaps half of the Republicans in Congress and maybe half of the Republicans in the country. There were several other questions, and I'll just attend to them briefly because we can always come back to them. In order to do those things that they wanted to do, they passed laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would by national power, national guarantee of the basic rights of all citizens of the United States. And Andrew Johnson vetoed that bill, and probably more than anything else, that veto was what led him to break with the Republican Party. The question about the Supreme Court, right? You know history. The Supreme Court has varied in its size, and while Andrew Johnson was president, the Republicans who opposed him did not shrunk the Supreme Court as Supreme Court members left the court, in part because they didn't want him to name a member, but mainly because there was some thought that it was unwieldy, and they wanted to streamline it. And finally, Johnson is a Jacksonian Democrat. Well, I'm sure we're going to come back to that. He loved Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson believed in strict construction of the Constitution. Johnson and Jackson both thought that the strict construction of the Constitution is what would help ordinary people in this country, and that the people who wanted broad construction were people who believed in special interests, monopoly, aristocracy.
Virtually every time you see portraits or anything connected with Andrew Johnson during our program, you will see a reference to the Constitution. Andrew Johnson was buried with his copy of the Constitution under his head, and it is a set of principles that are closely associated with how he framed his presidency. Let's take our next call. It is from Tampa, Florida. Welcome to our discussion on Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to everybody at C-SPAN for a wonderful series. One of the most worthwhile things I've ever seen on television.
Thank you, sir. We're learning a lot.
So am I. My question is this, with just a little bit of a background. Sam Houston was another pro-union Southerner, and my understanding is that during the Civil War, he remained in seclusion. He was basically left alone because of the respect that Texans had for him. He was a heroic figure, as we know. What happened to Andrew Johnson during this time? What did he do? Where did he live? How was he treated in the South? I'll get off the phone and listen to your answer. Thank you.
Johnson had a rough time of it during the secession crisis. Johnson was senator and in Washington, D.C., as the southern states were seceding, and the southern state senators were all there in Washington, D.C., on the floor of the Senate, and one by one, as their states seceded, those senators got up and made parting addresses defending secession, denouncing the North, defending slavery. And Johnson was there, and he was the only Southern senator from a state that seceded who did not resign and give that kind of a speech. Instead, he got up and he gave several speeches declaring loyalty and declaring that those people who were leaving were traitors who would deserve to be hung as traitors if they were captured. Tennessee, it wasn't certain whether it was going to leave the Union. It wasn't among the first states that did it. The first states were a wave of Deep South states. The Republicans, people like Andrew Johnson, fought like the devil to try to keep those border states, of which Tennessee was one, from seceding. So Johnson went back down to Tennessee after the session of Congress closed in a March and fought to try to keep it in the Union, went around the state speaking. The legislature provided for a convention that would take the state out of the Union and required people to vote for it. Johnson and his friends fought it and defeated it. The people of Tennessee refused to have that convention. Then, when the Northern troops fired on Fort Sumter and the war actually began, that changed things. And a lot of Tennesseans who had not been in favor of the Union now felt that if it came to a war, they'd have to leave. Johnson fought that too, but it was much tougher. Again, he went all over the state. He was threatened. On one occasion on a train, people came in to lynch him and he had to pull his guns out and back them down. He had to flee Knoxville, Tennessee, which had been a Unionist area, where he was trying to make a speech, to come back to Greenville. But in eastern Tennessee, he was safe until Confederate troops got here. And then he had to flee and he had to go back to Washington, D.C.
Next call is from San Diego. You're on the air, caller, for Andrew Johnson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a couple of comments that I'd like to make. One is that I want to thank C-SPAN for giving me an entirely new understanding of our Constitution on account of your presidential series. And the other thing I want to say is that a few minutes ago, I was reading David Herbert Donald's biography of Lincoln. And according to him, Lincoln had nothing at all to do with the choice of Andrew Johnson as vice president, which is a bit different from what you've been telling us. So I'd like to know where you got that idea from and help me understand what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as you're going to find out more and more often, and as we've said before, there are different interpretations that historians have when they look at the evidence. There's no question that Lincoln said nothing publicly to indicate that he wanted to replace Hannibal Hamlin, who was his vice president from Maine, with Andrew Johnson. But people who were familiar with Lincoln, who wrote later, but not too much later, said that in fact Lincoln was concerned with having a person of more recent Democratic antecedents than Hamilton Hamlin had as his vice presidential candidate in 1864. Lincoln was not at all sure he was going to win in 1864, and as a matter of fact was afraid he was going to lose. And he felt he needed to have the support of Democrats, many of whom were alienated by the fact that he had turned the war into a war against slavery as well as a war for the Union. And so we know that he was at least sounding out some possible recent Democrats who had been working with the Republicans to see how they would feel about being his vice president. We know that he sounded out Benjamin F. Butler, for example, which would have been an amazing thing, a person less likely to be a good president for sure than Andrew Johnson. And that he sounded out, or at least was thinking about, a guy named Daniel Dickinson from New York and John A. Dix, also from New York. He was worried about carrying New York. And he sent down a friend of his to at least talk to Johnson, see what he was like, and report back. And that's what we know. And we also know that if Lincoln had done anything to indicate to the convention that he wanted to keep Hannibal Hamlin, he would have been able to do it. What he also knew was that there was a big groundswell of support for Andrew Johnson for reasons we might talk about later. And he knew that if he didn't take action to defend Hannibal Hamlin, that Andrew Johnson was going to be the vice presidential candidate, and he didn't do anything. So there's my interpretation. David's a great historian, of course, and he has his own interpretation.
There's a Lincoln portrait in the Johnson home here in Greenville, Tennessee, in the parlor. Let's take our next call. It's from New York City.
Hello. I have a statistic that I think indicates just how much trouble Johnson had with Congress. The first 16 presidents vetoed 46 bills, and 5 of them were passed over their veto. Johnson alone vetoed 20 bills, and 17 of them passed over his veto. I just thought that might be a good example of just how much more than the usual amount of trouble he was having.
Thanks very much. I have a different set of statistics. One of the documents I have says 29 vetoes. Do you know how many there were, in fact?
No, actually, I didn't think to count them up before I came. But, of course, the point is well made either way. He vetoed bills like no president had before, and he was overridden like no president had been overridden before. And, of course, finally, if that isn't enough, they impeached him.
And we will be talking about the impeachment, first impeachment of a president in American history as our program progresses. Pacific Grove, California, you're on for our conversation about Andrew Johnson, president number 17. Good morning.
My name is Caroline Johnson, and I was the wife of Robert Johnson for nearly 50 years before his death. We were told by several members of the family that he was a descendant of William Johnson, Andrew's brother. At one time, among our Johnsonia was a copy of the notice passed out advertising a $10 reward for the return of 2 brothers, Andrew and William, who had run away from a tailor to whom they were indentured. Unfortunately, these parts of our family's inheritance were stolen. About 30 years ago, I took our then 10-year-old daughter to Greenville, where Margaret Patterson, Andrew's maybe great or granddaughter, showed us around the homestead, the family home which had just been given to the Park Service. My question, a very personal one, are there other male descendants with the last name of Johnson, such as my grandson's Andrew, from either Andrew or William, who survives today?
Thank you. I'm going to, because you're not an expert on the family, I'm going to reserve that question for when we talk with the folks from the National Park Service, because over the years they've worked with descendants of the family, and we'll get a better answer for you. But in fact, there was a William Johnson who was his older brother, and Andrew and Eliza Johnson had 4 children themselves, Martha, Charles, Mary, and Robert. Next telephone call is from Wadsworth, Ohio. You are on the air. Wadsworth, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question. Well, I got a couple of questions. The first one is, during the... I'm trying to turn the TV down. During the impeachment trial back in January, they made mention that the Senate wasn't elected by the people. Is that true? And how were they elected?
That is true. The United States Senate, until the early part of the 20th century, was elected in a joint ballot of the state legislatures, both the state House of Representatives and the state Senate, if a state happened to have 2 houses. One state, Nebraska, only has 1 house. And that's how a senator was elected. And that meant that in order to get elected, you had to be a very important member of your party. You had to have campaigned for an awful lot of these state legislators. They had to feel indebted to you. They had to feel that you were an ideal representative of the party, because in those days people didn't split tickets like they did now, and people voted for the whole party based on how they felt about the top of the party. And so when Andrew Johnson is elected senator, that is a real sign of a tremendous degree of respect and support from the entire Democratic Party of the state of Tennessee.
I missed one child in my lineup, and an important one, Andrew Johnson Jr. So count that number as 5 total children from Andrew and Eliza. Next call is from Wadsworth, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. This is for Mr. Benedict. We were talking about the, matter of fact, on C-SPAN this morning, I heard this, that Andrew Johnson, being a Democrat,
one of his many vetoes was a civil rights bill, which was passed over by the Congress afterwards. Can you expand on that?
Yes, of course. After the Civil War, the Republican Party as a whole, not just the radicals, wanted to be sure that slavery was truly ended and that the former slaves would have the complete freedom to work, to earn money, to buy property, to sell property, to inherit it, to go to court to protect themselves, to make contracts. All of these rights had been denied to slaves, and many of these rights had been denied to some degree even to free African Americans. And Republicans were extremely concerned that people have these rights. They waited for a while to watch what the southern states would do now that the war was over and now that Andrew Johnson had arranged for elections down there so that there were state legislatures and state governors down in the South. And as they watched, they were really dismayed to see that one state after another, when it passed laws defining what the new status would be of African Americans, limited those rights. And some of the states limited them so much that you could hardly say that these people would be citizens at all or free at all. And because of that, the Republicans passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And they thought Andrew Johnson would pass it, because would sign it, because Andrew Johnson had expressed concern for the rights of African Americans in the South. But instead, Andrew Johnson vetoed it. And it was a very tight question whether the Republicans would be able to pass it over his veto, because some number of Republicans had generally agreed with Johnson about a conciliatory policy to the South. And it was only at the last minute that the Republicans really saw that they had enough votes to pass it over Andrew Johnson's veto.
Les Benedict wrote this book back in 1973, The Impeachment of Andrew Johnson. It was reissued last year in paperback by W.W. Norton, and you can find it in any bookstore around the United States if you're interested in reading more. And not surprising, it was reissued last year because we had a second president who was impeached, joining Johnson in the history books. What was last year like for you?
Well, it was certainly a busy year for me. Naturally, the impeachment of President Clinton raised issues and memories about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and people wanted to know what we could learn from the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And a few of us historians who had dealt with it closely were asked pretty regularly what we could learn, how the impeachment compared, and were, had the great pleasure of making what we have worked at, because we love it, doing history, really important and known to the public at large.
In about 10 minutes, you will meet Jim Small, who is with the National Park Service at this site here, and we'll learn more about how they teach the impeachment of Andrew Johnson to visitors and what last year was like for them here, too, as people came here to learn more about this period of American history. Tahlequah, Oklahoma, you are on the air. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, Mr. Benedict, I would like to know how effectively Johnson used the spoil system to appease the South. And also I would like to know, in your opinion, what's the most positive and negative legacy that Mr. Johnson left behind?
Well, Johnson, as president, of course, had a good deal of authority over government offices. And the tradition was to reward your followers and your supporters with government office and to remove from government office those people who disagreed with your policies. Johnson did do that when it became clear that he was in disagreement with the Republicans. He did try to coerce office holders to support him, mainly, however, in the North. As far as the South goes, Johnson had the responsibility of reappointing virtually every national government office holder in the South. He wanted to do that in such a way as to strengthen those elements of the South that either had always been loyal or who at least had not wanted to secede in 1861. He did that by trying to appoint as governor in each of the southern states, temporarily, a person who fit that criterion, who had not been a strong secessionist. And he then asked those people to use their friendships and knowledge and connections to find other people of similar types and recommend to him who he should appoint. Those recommendations went to his cabinet members who were in charge of each of the departments, and they named people. And when that was over, Johnson had reset up the entire southern government. government. The problem was that, as it turned out, it wasn't easy any longer to distinguish between those people who had been loyal to the Union in the 1860s and those who hadn't, and who was really loyal now, who would protect the rights of black Americans, who would be sympathetic to the new order of things, and the people who he appointed wound up being not very sympathetic, really, to major changes into the South and to securing the rights of African Americans.
2 more calls and then you'll meet Jim Small. Our next call is from Tennessee, city of Memphis.
How you doing?
Morning.
Hold on one moment. I'm going to throw something off very different. I want to know Andrew Johnson's personal views against slavery before the Civil War. And second, what was Andrew Johnson's final years after he almost got kicked out of the presidency of the United States when he finished his term? Thank you. I just hang up right now and listen to it.
Thank you for your call.
Andrew Johnson was not anti-slavery before the Civil War. He did represent the ideas of those parts of the state of Tennessee in which the vast majority of people were not slaveholders and whose businesses and incomes and prosperity were not dependent on the plantation system in the plantation South. But none of those people really opposed slavery. They had some disagreements about what public policies should be in Tennessee, and they didn't like very much the fact that the slaveholding regions of Tennessee had extra representation in the Tennessee state legislature. Johnson tried to change that. Johnson, in his last few months as president after being acquitted on the impeachment, was pretty restrained. Part of the agreement that he had worked out with those Republicans who were what was necessary to vote in favor of acquitting him for him to get off, he reassured them that if they did acquit him, he would not continue to really attack the Reconstruction program as vigorously as he had before. So he was pretty quiescent. When he went back to Tennessee after he left the presidency, really he spent the last years of his life seeking vindication, and that meant to him getting re-elected to the Senate of the United States as senator from Tennessee, where he could go right back into the institution that had tried him as president and which had almost removed him.
So far, the only U.S. president to serve in the Senate after his presidency. Well, let's introduce you to Jim Small, who is joining us now live from the Johnson Historic Site. And Mr. Small is a Pennsylvanian, but he has been here at the Johnson site since 1990, and before that at a number of different sites associated with the presidents and American history for the Park Service. Mr. Small, we've got a lot to learn from you because all our calls so far have been talking about the politics in the presidency, and we've got to learn a little bit more about Andrew Johnson, the man. First of all, is he a native of Greenville?
No, Andrew Johnson's born in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1808.
And tell me about how he made it to Greenville from Raleigh. Tell us about his early years.
Well, basically, Andrew Johnson is indentured to Mr. Shelby, a tailor in Raleigh, North Carolina, at the age of 9, and will eventually run away at age 15. At age 17, he'll come to Greenville, actually heading towards Middle Tennessee, where his mother had family, but stops in Greenville for a while, then moves on to Rutledge, and then comes back to Greenville. He met a young lady, Eliza McCardle, fell in love with her, and would eventually marry her, and they would have 5 children and live in the homestead that we're at today.
I've read a story about Eliza watching Andrew Johnson come into town. Can you pass that along to our viewers?
Sure. Local lore has it that as Andrew walks through town one day, Eliza spots him with a group of her friends and tells her friends to mark it, that will be her husband, her future husband. And it's a great story, and I would like to think that it's indeed true.
He was the youngest married president. At what age were he and Eliza when the two married?
Well, he's born in 1808, and he's married in 1827. So that would make him 17, I believe.
17 years old. She was 16, I think.
Yes.
And we've heard that he was not illiterate, but uneducated.
Sure. Andrew Johnson has no formal education. Not because he didn't want to, it's because he couldn't afford a formal education. Back during this time period in our history, there were no public schools existing in the state of North Carolina where he was born and raised in his early years, or in Tennessee. So if you wanted your child to be educated, you had to pay a tutor, a teacher, to do that for you. And of course, Johnson's financial circumstances would not allow that. Mrs. Johnson could hardly provide good housing and a place for them to grow up after her husband dies. So no formal education. We do credit Eliza, his wife, with nurturing that desire to be educated. She is educated. She goes to a local girls' school here, which tells us that her parents had a good income, an expendable income for education, so she's very progressive for the time period. Johnson had to know math, some basic math skills to be a tailor, a fine tailor. He was well known for his craftsmanship. Had to know how to read patterns that would be shipped over from Europe to stay current and current garmentry, and probably knew how to write some, but not well. Mrs. Johnson improves on all those skills, tutoring her husband. She even reads to him as he works in his tailor shop.
Well, let's take a call or two, and then we'll come back and see the tailor shop and learn a little bit more about the role it played in his political development. New York City, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning. I'm a Cuban-American from New York City, and I have a question. Probably not a typical question about Andrew Johnson. Most people relate to Andrew Johnson as a president of the Reconstruction and also the impeachment issue. What about foreign policy, in particular Latin America? Now, I know during the Civil War, obviously the country was very much involved in the issue of the Civil War. France had invaded Mexico, for instance, and the French left in Mexico, I believe, in 1868. There was also, before Lincoln, the issue of purchasing Cuba, which happens to be my country of origin, by both Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. That was kind of dropped, the issue, and Cuba went into a war of independence in 1868. Could you comment a little bit about if there was any kind of foreign policy at the time of President Johnson?
Sure. And Dr. Benedict may want to follow up on this later. Secretary Seward is a wonderful Secretary of State. It's during Johnson's presidency that we purchased Alaska from the Russians. We annexed the Midway Islands. So we're very active under Seward's leadership in those areas. And also, communications takes a giant leap in foreign policy. The Atlantic cable is laid and it's working, and the first time that two heads of state ever communicate with each other is between Andrew Johnson and the Queen of England through the cable system across the Atlantic Ocean. So there is some foreign policy going on during Johnson's administration, but of course it's overshadowed. We've just suffered a tremendous civil war, and the healing process is beginning.
A few comments on foreign policy?
A couple of major issues that Johnson's had to face, and Seward was his leader in foreign policy, was negotiating some kind of settlement with England over the way that England had sympathized with the Confederacy during the Civil War. We blamed the United Kingdom, Great Britain, for outfitting Confederate raiders and for the depredations on American shipping, and we were demanding a huge indemnity. So big of an indemnity that Charles Sumner, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, said the only way that Britain could pay us back was to give us Canada. The other area that, speaking of Canada, that we had a major foreign policy problem was the efforts of Irish Americans to try to free Ireland by invading Canada. And taking over parts of Canada. And so we actually had to send armed troops up to the border areas up there to try to stop the so-called Fenians from invading Canada. And then there was the Mexican problem. We took a very hard line with the French in Mexico, in part, of course, because the French had been also opposed to the North in the Civil War, technically neutral, but really opposed. And we forced them to leave Mexico, which allowed the Republican forces in Mexico to sweep back to victory and turn Mexico into a republic. Very successful part of our foreign policy.
Jim Small, the National Park Service has preserved Andrew Johnson's tailor shop here in Greenville, Tennessee. Why?
Well, it's rather unique to be able to come to the presidential site here and see Andrew Johnson's humble beginnings. I mean, here you have our 17th president who starts out his life in poverty, and he worked with his hands to build his business, to eventually entering into politics and building a constituency. And you can see all of that here at the historic site. And then you visit his home, the homestead that we're in today, and you have an idea of he makes a success. It's the American story where he does well through his own hard work and energies.
How did that tailor shop play into his political development?
Well, the tailor shop, after Johnson becomes an alderman, there are many town meetings held in the tailor shop. Through the mayor's book, you'll read where they hold meetings, monthly meetings at the tailor shop, with Johnson presiding eventually as mayor. So it was a gathering place where political thought and debate were going on. Johnson loved to debate. You mentioned earlier about being a stump speaker. He's well known for being a good stump speaker, for speaking hours and holding the attention of the people who've come from miles to listen to him speak.
Let's take a call, and then we'll see where Andrew Johnson lived when he worked as a tailor, just right across the street. Chantilly, Virginia, welcome to the program.
I'd like to take issue with the historian's analysis of the Congress's motivation to override the veto of the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. The Congress, in my view, was not concerned with the rights of African Americans. Instead, in my view, they wanted to really stick it to the South. I mean, this was a rancorous and very hostile time, and what better way to stick it to the South than to give rights to the South's property? The very people they could buy and sell now have the right to buy property, to vote them out of office. So the North really wanted to stick it to the South. The North had no real sense of egalitarian. I mean, all we have to look at is the North's reaction to the great migration of blacks from the South to the North. They weren't worried about any sense of egalitarian then, or fairness then. So I really do think they wanted to really stick it to the South. I'd like to hear the historian's response to that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Les Benedict.
Well, you know, it's hard to imagine, I think, often at various times in American history, that white Americans actually could be very, very seriously concerned about the rights of black Americans. For much of time of this country, of course, we've had great racial troubles. But there are times when events happen that make people feel differently and think differently. And the Civil War period was one of those times. And the Civil War, of course, was a struggle that began over slavery. The position of African Americans in Southern society was right at the heart of it. Everybody knew that it was slavery that caused that war. And when we fought the war, ultimately it became a war to end slavery, in large part because we did want to deprive the leaders of the South of the power that they had over that society, which rested on their slaves. But nonetheless, that meant that you were fighting a war to end slavery, and it converted almost all the black Southerners in the South into allies of the North. And in fact, about 1/3 of the United States Armed Forces at the end of the war was made up of black soldiers, 187,000 African American soldiers who were replacing white soldiers in that war. There was tremendous sympathy that developed in the North as a consequence of that, a sense that if these people are good enough to die for the Union, if they were, at least when white Southerners were trying to destroy the Union, these people saved it, that you owed something to them. And that was a very widespread and strongly felt feeling. After all, if you wanted to stick it to the South, they'd all committed treason. You could have hung the leadership of the South for what they had done. You could have confiscated all of their land and all of their property. You could have put other people in jail. You could have taken away their right ever to vote again. You could have taken away all sorts of things from the South. Republicans didn't want to do that. Republicans wanted to restore a union based on good fellowship between the two sections, but also based on fundamental liberties for African Americans. And it turned out that that was going to be very hard to do, to both give basic rights to African Americans and make white Southerners want to like the Union again and belong to the Union again.
Let's return to Jim Small, who's live on the porch of Andrew Johnson's second home here in Greenville, one that was when he became more successful as a tailor. And it's important to have porches, especially when you're in summertime Greenville, isn't it, Jim Small?
Oh, yes. The humidity's high and the sun's starting to hit the porch. It's starting to warm up. But I can almost envision Andrew Johnson taking leisure time here on the porch and enjoying the morning.
Well, compare this home, which is where we are, with about 10 rooms in it, to his first home, which we're now going to show viewers on videotape.
It's important for your viewers to realize that the home that we're at today, the homestead, is very modest. And the one we're looking at now, his early home, is a home he lives in during the 1830s and eventually trades it for this home in 1851. The early home is made up of 4 rooms, not a very big house, and in that house he began to raise his family. And across the street from this house, the early home, would be his tailor shop. So it would be a very easy commute to work. Just basically walk across the street and he would be right where he needed to be when it was time to go to work. Andrew Johnson never forgets where he comes from in life. At the end of his life, his estate's valued at over $175,000, but he doesn't put any pretentious actions into that money. He lives very modestly. That homestead's made up of 10 rooms, very, very sparsely decorated.
Greenville, Tennessee is it took me about 90 minutes from the city of Knoxville. It is surrounded by mountains on both sides and has a long history of independence. Can you tell us a bit about the people of this region of the state and how that might have shaped Andrew Johnson?
Well, Johnson's ancestry is Scotch-Irish, as is most of the people living in East Tennessee and the mountains of North Carolina. Very independent-minded people. Even today, very hard-working people. We see today many businesses locating to East Tennessee because of that principle that's still current. The people in East Tennessee are very hard-working. During Johnson's lifetime, agriculture was very important. Cattle, some cotton, not much. Like Dr. Benedict mentioned earlier, that was not plantation-style farming in this area, but we were very sparsely settled in small settlements. You know, Greenville was not a large town at the time of Andrew Johnson. As a matter of fact, when he moves into this house in 1851, it's actually located in the county. And of course, today it's been surrounded by a growing community.
About how many people live in Greenville today?
The population of Greenville today is about 17,000.
And how many people come to visit the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site every year?
We average about 60,000 visitors a year. About 7,000 to 8,000 visit the homestead. And then in our museum where the tailor shop is housed, we have approximately between 18 and 9,000 people visiting that facility.
And you're adding a new attraction as well. It looks like there's some construction going on across the street from Andrew Johnson's first home.
There is. This community is very proud of Andrew Johnson, and they want to perpetuate his history and preserve it. And the estate of his great-granddaughter, Margaret Johnson Patterson Bartlett, is erecting a birthplace replica of where Johnson would have been born in Raleigh, North Carolina. So in all 4 corners at that intersection, you have the history of Andrew Johnson, from birth to Taylor to his early home, and then just 2 blocks away we have the homestead where he lives until his death in 1875. And then, of course, we maintain Andrew Johnson National Cemetery where the president is buried.
And we'll talk about that in a minute or two. In fact, if visitors to Greenville, Tennessee will see signs of Andrew Johnson all over the place, in addition to the number of buildings that are associated with the Park Service and preserved historically. Many businesses take their name from Andrew Johnson, a real sense of community pride in their native son. Les Benedict, this is your first time here. Did you see that as well?
Oh, yes. I mean, you come in and there's Andrew Johnson buildings, Andrew Johnson banks. There was once an Andrew Johnson hotel. To somebody who wrote a history of Andrew Johnson, it looks pretty good.
And if you haven't been to this part of the country, we encourage you to follow in our footsteps here. Many people have been taking this tour along with us. There's lots to see in these parts, and this is a really delightful and beautiful historic town. Let's take a call. Hattiesburg, Mississippi next.
How do you do? To Mr. Small, I have participated with the Vicksburg Military Park and the Ship Island Oceanside Park in developing Afro-American historical military sites. And the historians are very good friends of mine, and may your park expand. Mr. Bennett, I am an Afro-American historian here. You have got to mention the following key words: black coat in Mississippi, scallywags, carpetbaggers, redeemers, radicals, the Great Compromise, KKK. Now, from Mississippi, what Johnson did affected me in the Mississippi plans. Explain Mississippi Plan 1, that was done by Shockey under the Black Code. Mississippi Plan 2, dealing with the denial of blacks of registering to vote, and Mississippi Plan 3, which completely eliminate blacks from the voting rolls in 1890. Would you please define these key words, please, sir?
Thanks for your call.
When Andrew Johnson restores the southern states right after the war under his own authority, appointing provisional governors and then having regular governors elected in legislature, the legislatures turn to defining what the position is going to be of the freed slaves in their society. And every state legislature passes a code which recognizes the freedom of African Americans and gives them certain rights, but also clearly denies them other rights. And Mississippi's code was among the very worst. All of these codes came to be called black codes because they really did make separate rules for African Americans than they did for other people, and they looked somewhat similar to the old slave codes that had existed before the Civil War. Mississippi's didn't allow African Americans, for example, to go to court, to sue people, to testify in cases unless African Americans were involved in those cases. They weren't allowed to testify against whites. In order to follow certain professions, they had to meet various kinds of provisions and taxes that white people didn't have to. The punishments for violating crimes were different for white people than for black people, harsher for black people. There were laws against white people congregating with black people. There were laws against black people simply congregating in groups together. A very harsh code, and one of the things that led the Republicans to pass the Civil Rights Law of 1866 to overcome it.
Jim Small, where was Andrew Johnson buried?
Andrew Johnson's buried at Monument Hill, which is located just 2.5 blocks from his homestead. It was property that his family owned, and that when he died in 1875, he would have been buried on top of the hill. It's a beautiful monument. As you said earlier, he's buried with his Constitution as his pillow, and he's also wrapped in the flag of the United States. Johnson has a great passion for this country, a great passion for the Constitution. And his whole life is a mix of different dramas, a drama being an indentured servant, drama during the early stages of the Civil War, where he's out stumping to keep Tennessee into the Union, and then the drama of the impeachment process, and then the wonderful drama of going back to the United States Senate after his presidency. Some of these people who he went back to meet in the Senate chambers were the people who voted against him. And it's amazing how he handled himself. He would shake their hands and they would applaud him. So Johnson's life is a wonderful study of conflict, of just not between himself, but also of this country.
Visitors to the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site are given a replica of an impeachment ticket. Will you walk us through how the Park Service tells the story of the Johnson impeachment?
Susan, I'd be happy to do that. When you arrive at our visitor center, you'll park in our parking lot, of course, and you'll pass his early home. And we encourage you to stop in the early home first, because that's where you learn about Johnson's early life. And then you enter our visitor center. And at the visitor center, you're greeted by a park ranger, and you're given a replica of an impeachment ticket that would have been given out for those attending in the Senate galleries to hear the impeachment proceedings. And we encourage you to go through the presidential exhibits to learn about the time period that Johnson is president, the issues that he faced, and then to vote on whether or not Johnson should be found guilty or not guilty. And the exhibits have been in place for just a little over a year. We counted the impeachment tickets in May, and it was 9-1 in favor of acquittal for Andrew Johnson. And I must say, during President Clinton's impeachment, our visitation has been up. The media has shown renewed attention to Andrew Johnson. And it's made our job a little easier because most of our visitors that would come to the site had no idea what impeachment meant, or if they did know or thought they knew, they thought it meant removal from office. So it's been a wonderful education process for the Park Service to give to the people visiting our site.
I think I saw you last year on the Today Show on the morning when the Park Service changed the plaque that says the only U.S. president to be impeached.
Correct. Our exhibits at that time were 5 or 6 months old, and of course, who would have been able to look into a crystal ball on December 19th and find out that President Clinton had been impeached. So on that day, we had to change one of our exhibits because our exhibit said first and only president to be impeached. So on that day, we changed it out to say first president, which will always stand true.
Does the Park Service have a view? I mean, do you feel sympathetic as someone who has spent nearly a decade here to this person, or are you intentionally neutral?
My gosh, spending a decade makes me sound a little old. The Park Service, we're objective. We present both sides of the story. The reason we hand out the impeachment ticket is to allow the visitor to make a decision. I admire Andrew Johnson in the fact that he could have succumbed to peer pressure without any problem. He could have not stumped Tennessee during the early stages of the Civil War and just left the Senate. He could have not stood for the Constitution, and many of those issues that he does veto are based on constitutional issues, where the states in the Constitution were delegated rights, and that the federal government I should say the legislation was trying to impose their thoughts on. So I've got to admire him because of not succumbing to peer pressure.
Take some calls for you, gentlemen. Next is a call from Paradise, California.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My call is for probably your historian, but not Mr. Johnson particularly. I'm interested in the fact that all the presidents from 1840 on, except for Reagan, that were elected in the year ending with a number ending in 0, died in office. I thought it was called the Curse of Tecumseh, but apparently I was wrong. And can you explain that to me? Thank you.
Well, of course, there's not really much to explain. As you've just said, not everybody who's elected in 1960 dies in a 0 number dies in office. There are coincidences that happen, and I think that's one of them. There's nothing that we could possibly figure out that would explain why there would be any rule like that, or why President Reagan would have been the only person spared from it if there was a rule like that.
Highland, California. Highland,
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize. I just tuned in. It's rather early out here when you start your program. So if you have already answered my question, I will understand.
That's all right. Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. Number one has been my understanding that the impeachment of Andrew Johnson was mostly because of the radical Republicans, particularly Andrew Stevens, that didn't like the carrying on of what Johnson thought was Lincoln's policy as far as Reconstruction of the South.
And what's question number 2?
Question number 2 is there's been rumored or often said that if Andrew Johnson wasn't a true alcoholic, that he was quite a drunkard, and I'd like to have some comment on that.
All right, thanks. Jim Small, would you take the alcohol question?
Sure, that's no problem. There's no question that Andrew Johnson was under the influence during his inaugural speech as vice president. But there's no other evidence in Johnson's career of ever being under the influence of alcohol. Lincoln chooses Johnson to be his military governor in Tennessee, so he must respect Johnson's character to take on that great responsibility. And then Lincoln himself will say that Andy ain't no drunkard. I need no further proof. Lincoln, the great emancipator and the great president that he was, his words are good enough for me.
Quick answer on Reconstruction and the Radical Republicans.
The Republicans impeached Andrew Johnson because he, as president, was using every power at his command to try to undermine and prevent the Reconstruction laws that Congress had passed to restore the Union from being carried out. And that was creating a tremendous crisis for the country, one that possibly was going to result in violence. And they really ultimately saw no way out. I hope later on we'll get a chance to talk about that, but that was a very reluctant thing they did when they impeached Andrew Johnson.
Jim Small, as we say goodbye to you for this segment, I want to thank you. This is not the first time the C-SPAN school bus has arrived, but this time we brought along 15 people with us and create quite a commotion. I want to thank you, your boss, Mark Corey, and all the staff of the Park Service who have been so helpful here as we've tried to help other people understand more about the legacy of Andrew Johnson.
Well, Susan, I know that you've had many of your viewers thank you and C-SPAN for their the program. I would like to personally thank you all for the wonderful job you as a team do in your setup. You've been wonderful to work with, and you're invited back anytime.
Well, aren't you nice? As we're going to take a break right now, I want to tell the audience that we like to show a little bit behind the scenes here, and we've done something that would probably amaze Andrew Johnson and his wife Eliza. We've brought air conditioning to the Johnson homestead so that we can do this program outdoors. And I don't know if one of our cameras can show a little bit about this creation we have here, but we're actually piping in a little AC to keep Les Benedict cool. I don't need it, of course, Mr. Benedict, but to keep us cool during our 2.5-hour program and have cooled down this hot Tennessee July morning. So it's been quite a sight and quite a setup. Our thanks to the Park Service for their help. We're going to take a little break right now, and we'll be back and talk more about the life and times of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president. Of the 17th President of the United States. Our set this morning is in the garden, and I want to introduce you to a gentleman who knows this area well. His name is Dr. Robert Orr. He's a local historian, teaches at Walters State Community College in Greenville, a native of Greenville, Tennessee. I'm going to ask you to tell me a little bit about what this town was like in the 1850s when Johnson was a successful tailor involved in local politics.
Well, it was a small town. It was less than 1,000. There was a fair amount of brick buildings. Even in 1826, when he came there, the age of brick had already begun. But most of the buildings were frame, and most of the people engaged in agriculture. One of the few differences I found with Dr. Benedict's excellent presentation is that there was quite an emancipationist movement in Greene County and Greenville and East Tennessee generally. For example, when Johnson first became mayor of Greenville, this was 1834, there was a constitutional convention that year, and Greene County sent 3 petitions asking that the constitutional convention emancipate the slaves. There was something like 378 signatures on the petitions. The East Tennessee delegates in general to the constitutional convention demanded emancipation. They were outvoted, but in general, the majority of the delegates were in favor of emancipation. And that had a profound effect on Johnson. The new Constitution, the Constitution of 1835, had a clause in it that said that the state legislature could no longer emancipate the slaves. But before the Constitution was ratified, another series of petitions was raised asking for emancipation. Then after the Constitution came into existence, the East Tennessee emancipationists decided that the only way to emancipate the slaves was to separate East Tennessee from the state and then emancipate the slaves in the state of East Tennessee. And the man that introduced the resolution for separate statehood in the state legislature was Andrew Johnson, then state senator. Earlier, he had voted as a state representative against a proposed bill to ban abolitionist literature from the mails. So he was much more associated with the East Tennessee emancipationists than is usually recognized.
We should note that, in fact, he did have slaves while he lived in this house. Do you know anything about his relationship with them?
Yes, his relationships with them were quite good. In fact, he became a slave owner because Dolly, his female slave, came up to him at a slave auction and asked him to buy her. That was an East Tennessee tradition. It's mentioned in some letters by an abolitionist named Ezekiel Birdseye. Oftentimes, East Tennessee slave owners would purchase their slaves to save them from a harsher fate, being sold south or being owned by a harsh landowner. Now, that's an unusual fact, but it's attested both by Johnson in one of his speeches and by Johnson's last surviving slave, Will Johnson, who said as much in an interview with Ernie Pyle.
How many slaves did he have altogether, and when did he free them?
I'm not sure of the exact number. Of course, it varied. I don't think it ever got as high as 10, 6, something like that. And he freed them in, well, there's even a date, August the 8th, 1863. According to Will Johnson, the slaves were just told one day that they were free and that they were free to go or to stay. And Will Johnson said they all chose to stay. The date, August the 8th, is known because it became Emancipation Day among the black population of Greenville and East Tennessee. And the date was chosen because it was the date that Johnson had freed his personal slaves, and it was taken as indicative that freedom was coming. And Johnson, after the presidency, after he came home to Greenville, was often a guest at these August the 8th meetings.
We welcome your telephone calls as part of our process here and help us learn a little bit more about history as we go along by your questions, and many of you with additional information about the periods we're looking at. Here are the telephone numbers: 202-624-1111 if you live in the eastern half of the United States, 202-624-1115 for those of you in the western half. Worcester, Massachusetts, good morning.
So that's Worcester, Massachusetts.
Thank you. I thought that was Worcester. Go ahead.
Earlier, Dr. Benedict mentioned that during Johnson's dealings with Congress, there were no representatives from the South. However, under Lincoln's plan, his 10% plan for Reconstruction, 4 states from the South, including Tennessee, did come back into the Union. And I was just wondering if anyone could comment on whether there were representatives from the South, and if so, how they, what influence they had on the impeachment and whether they supported Johnson.
As I understand it, the Congress refused to seat anyone from southern states after the election of 1865, the reason being that the southern states elected many people who were ex-Confederate leaders, such as Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president. And when they did that, the Congress, who has the right to judge on the qualifications of its members, refused to seat any of the southern delegations, even Tennessee. There's one other small point to be made there. During the Civil War, there were a few people in the House of Representatives. Now, Professor Benedict is correct that Johnson was the only senator, but 1st District Representative Nelson didn't take his seat, but Maynard, who was a 2nd District representative elected in 1861, did take his seat in the federal Congress, and I think the 3rd District representative also eventually took his seat.
Johnson himself had an early interest in politics and held many local positions. You can see he was an alderman in this city and then mayor of this city. He went on to be a local state representative and state senator, governor of this state. How important as a Tennessean is he to you as part of the state's history? Give us some context about his view as a native son.
Well, I think Johnson was a very good man in terms of representing his state. the mass of the people. Now, he did have this conflict with slave owners, and I believe, contrary to Professor Benedict, that he believed in gradual emancipation and eventual colonization. This is visible in his speeches. He didn't make a particular case of it. In other words, he was in a position that being a Southern politician, had he made a strong stand for abolition, immediate, uncompensated abolition, he would, of course, not have been elected. So he had to be very careful, as the East Tennessee emancipationists were in general. But in his speeches, for example, his speech on the admission of Texas, he says that his hope is for the eventual movement from bondage to freedom for the slaves. So his position was really not that much different from Lincoln's. You'll recall probably in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln said, I want to put slavery in the direction of abolition, even if it takes 100 years. And that's the sort of position that Johnson had. A gradual plan, perhaps with colonization, but ultimately freedom for the slaves.
Next call is from Charleston, West Virginia.
I'm here.
Go ahead.
Hello, I'm here. You ready?
We're ready.
All right. I have a little problem. Maybe it's just a semantics problem with the word impeached. To me, it denotes past tense, means that the charges were sustained. And I do not think they were sustained in President Johnson's case or in President Clinton's case. To me, impeachment is charges have been brought. In other words, to charge someone with murder does not make a murderer out of that person. And I believe that the impeach itself means to impugn one's character or record. And I don't think in either case those charges were sustained. So I don't see why it even is referred to as impeached past tense, because it is not done. It's only a charge. Now explain that difference to me. Why it's why it is regarded as having been impeached when the impeachment charges were only brought and not sustained. Explain the difference.
It's an interesting question. Impeach means essentially to challenge. If in court you impeach a witness, you challenge a witness. You don't convict the witness of anything. And it's the same in this case. You challenge or accuse the president, and then he has to be either acquitted or convicted.
But he was impeached, and that is why,
impeached.
according to the constitutional process, and that, sir, is why people include that in the record with President Johnson and President Clinton. Neither were convicted, as you pointed out. But our Park Service folks told us that many people confuse the terminology and think that impeachment alone means conviction. So thanks for asking the question to clarify that it in fact means charges brought against. Napa, California.
Yes, a lot of people are talking about the Civil War, and they forget that the beginning of the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery per se. The big agriculture business of the South, the big plantations, wanted to trade with foreign countries and import things, and the northern manufacturers controlled the Congress and said no. So the whole thing was originally economic. Now look at the Southern enlisted man. The enlisted man his family didn't own slaves for the most part. If you told them you're going to fight them Yankees because they want to free old Massa's slaves, they would have said, "Oh, well, I want to die for this." No, but they fought like demons because they were told that their state was being invaded. So I think we should think of that a little bit.
Thank you for your call.
Well, there's a lot in what he says. The tariff issue is certainly important, but I think you can't avoid the fact that slavery was a major issue between the two sections. One little piece of local history that might be of interest that sort of gets to that point is I was looking through the court records in the Greene County Courthouse, and just as the war began, there was an order to confiscate all weapons from the free blacks in Greene County. So they knew that the race question ultimately was at the basis of the conflict.
During the Civil War, I read that here in his hometown of Greenville, Andrew Johnson was treated to a banner across the street that said "Andrew Johnson, traitor," because of his stand against secession. What about after the war? How was he viewed here?
Well, the story is that the banner that greeted him when he came back was "Andrew Johnson, patriot." But there's one other issue about that Andrew Johnson, traitor banner that's interesting. Johnson left Greenville just before the Greenville Convention, and the national flag still flew at the flagpole when Johnson left town because it was taken down during the Greenville Convention and replaced with a Confederate flag. So we know that on one side of the street there's the banner Andrew Johnson Trader, but on the other side of the street at the courthouse flagpole is the national flag.
And how about today? How do people think of him here in Greenville?
Of Johnson? Oh, I think most people realize that he was a fairly solid and good man.
And are proud of him and his legacy?
I think so, yes.
Right now, as we do each one of these programs, we're going to be joined by telephone by a teacher. His name is Dean Small. He teaches 5th grade at the Andrew Johnson Elementary School in Kingsport, Tennessee. Kingsport's about 45 minutes away from Greenville. And Dean Small, tell us a bit about how you teach your students about this native son.
Well, we talk quite a lot about his humble beginnings, as we heard earlier today, born in North Carolina and moved to Tennessee as a young man. And my students have always been intrigued by the idea that he was an uneducated person, certainly capable of learning, but had the good fortune to meet a teacher and marry a young teacher as a young man. And basically she educated him in the field of math and improved his reading and writing skills. And they are intrigued by the fact that fate, in a way, determined quite a bit of what happened to this man in the future.
Do you bring students here to the site?
Yes, ma'am. Our lower grade classes each year go down to Greenville to visit the President's home and greatly enjoy it. And Mr. Small does a fine job of hosting our students there.
Are you related?
No, we're not. I have a brother, but not the same Jim Small that you're meeting in Greenville today.
When you bring your students here, and again, they are how old?
Generally speaking, first, second graders.
And what most intrigues them? What do they like to look at, to touch, and to talk about?
They particularly like to see the home that's inside the building, the log home, see what they consider to be primitive items that were used by the people in the 1800s. And they're also intrigued by the fact that, we hear about presidents. To them, a president is a long ways away, but they go to Greenville, they see his home, they touch, they look, they hear, and they get an idea that the president's a real person and not so far removed from Kingsport.
How important is it to your students that he's a Southerner and their own Southern heritage?
They view that not in a way you might. They're maybe more open than I would have been when I was in the 5th grade. They realize our country's diversified a lot, but they're proud that we do have a president from Tennessee, but that's not particularly in the interest of theirs.
Do you know how your school became the Andrew Johnson School when Kingsport's 45 minutes away?
In Kingsport, we have 7 elementary schools, all named after presidents of the United States. We have a middle school named after one, Sevier, named after one of the early leaders of Tennessee. And apparently, from the formation of our town in the early 1900s, we just taken pride in the national leaders of our country, including President Johnson.
I understand that you would like to ask our historian some questions as you study your own history of Andrew Johnson and of the state.
Right. I have a question for either Dr. Bennett or Mr. Orr. Let me first make a statement that during the first 8 months of the Johnson presidency, he worked to pardon a lot of former Confederate leaders, and he wanted to quickly restore the southern states that had seceded, and most likely those southern states would have been led by the former Confederate leaders. Now, I'm aware that during his first 8 months of the presidency, Congress was not in session in Washington, but my question of one of the two gentlemen would be, why did President Johnson choose to exclude Congress from his early Reconstruction processes? Although they weren't in session, I would think that maybe he could have consulted with them, but if he did, apparently he did not follow the wishes of a lot of the Republican Congress.
Dean Small, why don't you stay on the line for the answer, and we'll see if you have a follow-up.
Thank you.
President Johnson was a Democrat, and among the issues that had divided Democrats from Whigs was the powers of the presidency. He believed in a strong presidency. One of his greatest speeches on the floor of the Senate was defending the right of President Polk to veto whatever bill he wanted, not just bills that he thought was unconstitutional. He had a stronger idea of the presidency even than Abraham Lincoln did. Abraham Lincoln believed that the president had powers that he could share with Congress, that he could do things, that he didn't just have to sit there as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and as the chief executive of the country, but he always agreed that Congress had the final say. President Johnson didn't agree with that. President Johnson thought that it was his responsibility to restore the southern states to normal conditions in the Union as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And that's why he didn't bring Congress into session to work with him. He wanted to do it himself. He thought he could do it well enough that Congress would go along with it when he was done. And I think that's the reason.
Mr. Small, follow-up question?
That clearly explains to it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for telling us about how you teach your elementary school students about Andrew Johnson.
Thank you.
Thanks for participating. Well, gentlemen, now that you're both here together, I'd like to ask if you can identify, because we've talked a little bit about the fact that historians, basically their job is to interpret facts with the distance of view of time. Both of you are historians of the period. How do you differ in your view of Andrew Johnson? If you had to put a capsule on him, what's the difference between your major opinions of this man? Mr. Orth?
Well, I have not read his work, so I can't say exactly. I listened to the presentation today and found very little to disagree with. On that last issue, I could find small disagreements. Lincoln, in his last cabinet meeting, said, I'm glad that Congress is out of town. This way we can get the ex-Confederate states back into the Union before they come back, and we won't have to deal with the discordant members. I suspect that we could find areas of disagreement. I have found that in the appointments of Johnson's last years as president, that there is an indication that he was very much in favor of black civil rights, and I think we would probably disagree on that. For example, in the summer of 1867, he attempted to get Frederick Douglass to take over the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, that's not usually recognized in the studies on Johnson, but it's there in the records. It's there in Gideon Wells' diary. It's in a recent Life and Letters of Frederick Douglass. If he was willing to face the Reconstruction with Frederick Douglass at the Freedmen's Bureau, he was not attempting to injure black civil rights in any sense.
Well, let me just ask the big ticket question then. Generally, looking back with the view 160 years, do you believe that this country should view Andrew Johnson's legacy as a positive one?
Yes, I think so. I think his principal task that he set himself was to hold the country together, to pull the North and the South together. He said as much in speeches after the presidency. He said this is a great country, and if the North and the South will just begin to cooperate again, it will be the greatest country, and that was what he basically wanted.
And Les Benedict, your view, should history treat him kindly?
Well, I don't really think so. I mean, he is a great man. Johnson was a great man. And he believed powerfully in what he did, and he was as honest as a president could ever be. And all those things are wonderful legacies. He stood absolutely for what he believed in, something that I think a lot of us feel now we would really like to see more in our politics. But his positions on the issues at a time of tremendous crisis for America about what kind of nation we were going to have after the Civil War was really one that stood for a white man's government. That's where, of course, Dr. Orr and I disagree. Dr. Orr has been working on this hard and a lot, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what he writes and what his evidence is. He's given us some of it. Some of that evidence I didn't know about. I didn't know about his overtures to Frederick Douglass. But President Johnson and Senator Johnson made speeches on the nature of African Americans, and they are so racist in content, really, that I don't think I could quote them on television. Some of the things that he said. He does not seem to have believed that Africans, as he put it, were anywhere near the level of white people on the evolutionary scale of creatures. He did not believe that they were capable of self-government. He thought it a terrible risk to the South to give African Americans the vote, and the twin pillars of his positions, as far as I can see, were state rights, local control over race relations, and the defense of what he called a white man's government.
Gentlemen, let's take some more telephone calls. Our next one is from North Carolina. As we listen, we're going to show you the Johnson birthplace. Johnson was born in North Carolina himself, and we'll show you a little bit of what that looks like. Our call is from Cameron, North Carolina. Cameron, you're on the air.
Hello. I'm a U.S. history teacher at Northmore High School in Robbins, North Carolina, just north of Carthage. And I'd like to know a little bit about Andrew Johnson as a tailor in Carthage.
Thank you. Bob Orr, can you tell us about his early life as a tailor?
I don't know anything about his life as a tailor in Carthage, if that was the question.
Yes. We've both been reading up a little bit. You want to add some facts?
Well, I can't speak to his life as a tailor in Carthage, if that's the key matter. But his background is really interesting as a tailor. You know, we tend to think of being a tailor as being really lower class and plebeian, and isn't it wonderful how he developed? Well, of course it is wonderful. He's one of the few presidents who really did go from a log cabin to the President of the United States. But when he was indentured as a tailor, he learned, apprenticed as a tailor, he learned a very skilled craft. One that put him in great demand. This is before the days you had manufactured clothing. He was in intimate contact with the wealthiest people in the community who he literally had to measure. I mean, intimate contact, measuring exactly how they fit, their sizes, how he would put these things together. He had to cut. It was a tremendous skill to be able to cut the materials, not to waste materials and to make them fit exactly. He became obviously a very influential man in his community, and it really says something about America that you would be so respected as an artisan and then be able to launch yourself on the kind of career he did. And he loved this country for it. And one of the reasons that he would not join the secession is because he became convinced in 1860, as he put it, that the real reason that the Southerners wanted to go was not just to protect slavery in the Union, but to protect slavery in the South from white Southerners who might turn against it. And some of Dr. Orr's information that he's giving helps explain why, put that kind of statement of his in context. Plainly, as I said, he was not opposed to slavery in my view, but he was not committed to it the way that other people were.
Well, when he first enters the House of Representatives, he votes in favor of a bill, or he votes against a bill to abolish slavery, abolish abolition materials from the mails. Then he introduces a bill to make East Tennessee a separate state so that he can abolish, so they emancipate the slaves in East Tennessee. Now, he never connected that with the statehood initiative, but it was connected that way by others. After that, he wanted to base representation on voters rather than voters plus 3/5 of the slaves. That would give East Tennessee more representatives in the state legislature and possibly be able to secure statehood for Tennessee. And he was called an abolitionist by Parson Brownlow, by William B. Campbell, by many people who were his opponents who understood his politics. So to say that he was in favor of slavery, I think is wrong. If you look at his speeches, he's for gradual emancipation, possibly with colonization, and that was exactly the position of Abraham Lincoln.
Much of our reason in doing this is to help all of us learn, but especially people who teach. We just heard a call from a history teacher. And in fact, C-SPAN has an entire set of teaching materials available for this series. We have folks in our company who work in a group called the Educational Services Unit. Our program is called C-SPAN in the Classroom, and they are standing by to hear calls or take emails from teachers about how you can receive this kit of free teaching materials. Here's how you reach them. On the internet, our email address is cspan.org/classroom, and our telephone number 202-626-4858. 202-626-4858, and that is for teachers to use to get free teaching materials on this historical series looking at the lives of the American presidents. If you don't have a pen handy, we'll give you that number again before our program ends. We've got a call standing by from Atlanta, and you are now on the air.
Yes, I was in Greenville several years ago visiting a relative, Ralph Finney, who I know lived to a ripe old age of 102, I believe. And he was working on the papers and memorabilia of Andrew Johnson, and I'd just like to know where that stands and if someone has finished that up.
That stands in a muddle, and no one has finished it up.
How much of his works are collected? How many papers do we know exist of Andrew Johnson?
Actually, the collection I think she's speaking about didn't have much on Johnson himself. It had a lot on the Reconstruction and some on the family. It's an interesting collection. It's in private hands right now. Hopefully it will be in a library soon.
Where are Andrew Johnson's presidential papers?
They're at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where they are presently being collected. They are being published. The last volume of that collection, volume 15, should be coming out anytime now.
I'm going to go back to some facts. Could you talk a little bit about the size of the United Country when the war ended, when Johnson took office, and how much land, either additional states or additional territories, that were acquired during his presidency?
Well, at the time Johnson becomes president, the United States has reached the territorial extent that it presently has. It goes from coast to coast. California is already in the Union. Oregon came in the Union just before the war began. Washington is still a territory. All parts of the central countries. Nebraska is a territory, going to become a state soon. Oklahoma is Indian territory at this time. So the extent of the country is there. Not everybody knows that this is the final extent. There's some thought that maybe we will annex Canada. There's some thought we might annex Cuba. President Grant actually tries to annex what's now the Dominican Republic. But Johnson wasn't a tremendous annexationist except for that wonderful acquisition of Alaska. Huge territory up in the northwest that most Americans knew nothing about. Called it Seward's Folly when we bought it because they thought it was all covered with ice. But of course it's one of the great legacies of Andrew Johnson's administration of this country.
Horsegall, California. Good morning to you.
Great job, C-SPAN. My question is for the historians. At that time, the blacks and the slaves in America, it's my understanding that 97% of them couldn't read or write, and they couldn't even sign their name. And the radical Republican Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau and built 965 new schools in the South, and also hospitals, and provided housing and transportation. And I just wondered, how Andrew Johnson worked with that.
Bob Orr.
Well, he attempted to veto the Freedmen's Bureau bill because he believed it was unconstitutional. But once it was passed over his veto, I believe he allowed it to function as it was intended to, and appointed the people that were suggested to him, such as General Howard, to head the Bureau.
What did the Freedmen's Bureau do?
It essentially oversaw the transition from slavery to freedom throughout the South.
Dr. Benedict?
Well, Andrew Johnson didn't have much use for the Freedmen's Bureau. He inherited Oliver Otis Howard as the commissioner, did everything he could to undercut him, sent friends of his own, appointed people who were in the military to investigate all sorts of rumors about corruption that came back to Andrew Johnson from white Southerners who had no use for the Freedmen's Bureau either. Andrew Johnson completely subverted the Freedmen's Bureau, and it's one of the reasons I mention it's because to understand that impeachment. During the war, the Congress passed laws confiscating the property of Confederates. And that property was taken over by the government, and it was supposed to be formally confiscated in the courts. And when Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau the first time in 1864, they turned all that land over the Freedmen's Bureau to be used to support freedmen, and ultimately to be divided into plots for freedmen to be farms and to sell to them. President Johnson, at the end of the war, for reasons that are not terribly bad, decided to pardon almost all the people who had fought in the war. He wanted to restore loyalty from the white Southerners, and he thought pardoning was the way you had to do it. But when he pardoned them, he decided that that pardon included return of all the property that had been taken from them that had not been formally sold to third parties. And the result was that most of what the Freedmen's Bureau did for the following 2 years was return land to former slave owners and throw African Americans off of it.
We have about 40 minutes left in our discussion about the life and times of Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States. On Monday, we'll answer the question for you, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Well, of course, it's Ulysses S. Grant, and it is another site that is supervised by the National Park Service, and it will be the location for our discussion of the 18th President, Ulysses S. Grant. That's Monday, July 12th. Beginning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time from Grant's tomb in New York City. Recently refurbished and restored, so I'll give you a good look at it and its current condition. Next call for Andrew Johnson's discussion is from Seattle.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. I enjoy watching it every day. I was watching a program this morning, your Washington Journal program, and there was a guest on from representing the Manhattan Institute, and the basis of his comment was how many citizens in America associate the Republican Party as being a racist party, the Democratic Party as being liberal, advocating for the rights of people of color. However, in the opinion of this particular guest from the Manhattan Institute, in his opinion, that Andrew Johnson, along with Woodrow Wilson, was probably the most racist president we've ever had, and that his policies and his speeches and et cetera really didn't do much to advance the well-being of African Americans during Reconstruction. And I would like for your two guests to comment on that.
Well, thanks. You've actually just touched upon the core of the difference in views of our two guests, so I'm sure they'd be happy to. Before they do, let me tell you, the room you were just looking at inside was the bedroom that belonged to Eliza, Andrew Johnson's wife. She was ill throughout most of his presidency. She had what was called consumption at the time. What's consumption? Tuberculosis, and was an invalid, rarely made public appearances during Andrew Johnson's presidency. And that chair right by the window there is actually an invalid chair, which would allow her to, after she was seated in it, to be moved around the room. And she sat there by the window, we understand, to enjoy some of the breezes from the garden where we're sitting. Well, the policies of Andrew Johnson and whether or not he was a racist. Gentlemen, you've talked about it before, but Bob Orr, why don't you respond to that caller?
Yes. Well, I've mentioned the attempt to appoint Frederick Douglass to the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't see how anyone who knows Frederick Douglass can believe that Johnson was intending to subvert civil rights for blacks and make that initiative. But there's another one that's not well understood, too, and that's Lorenzo Thomas. Lorenzo Thomas is the man he attempted to appoint, or didn't attempt, he did appoint, first as Adjutant General in the War Department, and then Secretary of War ad interim when he fired Stanton in February 1868. Lorenzo Thomas is dismissed in the Johnson literature as a bumbling old fool, but that's completely wrong. He had a fine civil rights record. He was sent by Lincoln to the Mississippi Valley in 1863 to organize black regiments and to see to the problems of refugees. And he wrote a summary of his activities after the war, and I can't quote it exactly, but this is a fairly close paraphrase. He said, "The prejudice against black soldiers was very extreme when I first started my efforts, and it took all my efforts to overcome it." And he says, "But finally the black soldiers, by their coolness and determination in battle, overcame the prejudice against them." Now this is the man that Johnson selects to replace Stanton. Now there were plenty of racists around. If he'd wanted a racist to replace Stanton, he could have found one, but he didn't want a racist. He wanted Lorenzo Thomas with his excellent civil rights record.
Well, Andrew Johnson had, of course, policies that we can see what he did. What he did was he vetoed the Civil Rights Bill. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. He claimed he did that because of their infringements of state rights, and he did do it because of their infringements of state rights. But the fact was that Republicans had to weigh the necessity for protecting the rights of African Americans against their commitment to state rights. And although they had a strong commitment to state rights and did as little as they could to disrupt the Union in order to protect black rights, they chose black rights. And Andrew Johnson didn't. Andrew Johnson met Frederick Douglass a year earlier than his thoughts about replacing Oliver Otis Howard with Douglass. That itself was a trick. He wanted to get rid of Oliver Otis Howard, and the problem was, how was he going to do that in a way that would not unite all the opponents against him? And one way was to try to use Frederick Douglass as a cat's paw. He did the same thing with Ulysses S. Grant, using him when he tried to replace Edmund N. Stanton the first time. But he met Frederick Douglass earlier than that. In 1866, Frederick Douglass goes to visit President Johnson to ask him to support that civil rights bill that Johnson later vetoes. Johnson deals very courteously with Frederick Douglass, but tells him that he's not going to do that, and talks about his own relationships to African Americans, saying many of the things that Dr. Orr does about how he had never sold a slave and things like that. After he leaves, Johnson turns to his secretary, who writes down the information, and he turns and he says, "That damned," and then he uses another term, not Negro, "that damn Negro, he's just like all of them. He'd as soon skin a white man as talk to him. He thought he had me trapped, but I showed him."
Mr. Orr, quick response?
Yes. In the first place, we don't know that he said that. The report comes from his secretary, William Moore, and William Moore was a confidential secretary, and if he carried tales, then he's not a confidential secretary. Gideon Welles considered him to be a spy for Edwin Stanton. He said that there were conversations that were let out, and the only person who could have a source was William Moore. So William Moore's standing in that is an unusual one. But let's assume it's true. I freely concede that Johnson was capable of saying the things that he's reportedly said. It seems to me clear he'd been defeated in this debate. Frederick Douglass and Downing and the rest of them had the better points, and Johnson argued with them, and he lost. And his angry remarks are the remarks of a defeated debater. But the thing is, a year later, in the summer of 1867, he had accepted all their points, because he gave an interview with a Boston Post reporter, and the Boston Post reporter said, "How are you going to enforce these Reconstruction Acts?" And he said, "I'm going to do it like this. Fair registration of all qualified voters without regard to race or color, and equal rights for and fair treatment of everybody under the law code." And he said, in areas such as South Carolina, where the blacks are in the majority, they should rule. In areas such as Texas, where whites are in the majority, the whites should rule. Now, the problem is, this sounds good. It sounds like that he's come over to Congress. But Congress had moved beyond that. Now Congress was saying, let's give votes to the blacks in the South and take the votes from the whites in the South. So he was still in conflict with Congress, even though he had come over to the position of complete civil rights.
Next call for our guest is from Akron, Ohio.
Yes, I'm calling from Akron. My name is Mike. I also teach history at Akron as well, and so I'm quite interested in this subject. I have a question concerning a senator from Kansas named Edmund Ross. I believe he cast the deciding vote that acquitted Johnson. I just wonder how do historians know that it was his vote and not somebody else's vote that acquitted Johnson? I do know the vote count was 35 to 19, 35 to convict, 19 to acquit, one short of the 2/3 necessary. I also know that Ross's career was ruined as a result of this vote. Why was his ruined when others who voted to acquit him may not have been ruined by as much?
Thank you. Dr. Les Benedict of Ohio State. Talk about Senator Ross.
Well, Senator Ross, every single vote that voted to acquit Andrew Johnson was crucial. If any single person who voted to acquit him had instead voted to convict him, he would have been removed from office. So, of course, they were all equal. The difference was that people didn't know how Senator Ross was going to vote. There were 2 or 3, actually maybe 4 or 5 even, Republicans whose votes were uncertain, and Ross's was one of them. Of those people whose votes were uncertain, he was the most recently elected, the least well-known, the one with the very softest political base. He was simply nominated by the governor of Kansas to replace the previous senator who had died. So he had no real political base. And it seemed unlikely that a man like that would withstand the tremendous pressure that Republicans were putting on all of their colleagues to remove President Johnson for fear that if they didn't, there was going to be complete disaster in the South. And Senator Ross decides to vote to acquit. We don't know exactly why. He, of course, claimed that it was purely on the basis of the law and what he thought was right. I don't think there's any doubt that he thought it was right. He also was having trouble with the Republican Party in Kansas and was on the outs with them. But he probably did what was right. But he did write a book about it about 20 years later. And it's a very dramatic book about his experience in that trial. And he says at the end of that book, "I looked into my open grave," as he stood to give that vote. And it is so dramatic and striking that he has become the kind of emblem. And President John F. Kennedy, when he wrote his tales of great profiles in courage about great politicians who stood up for what they thought was right, included Edmund G. Ross as one of them, and that's really helped to make his career.
Greenville is right off. You have something you want to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to say just a couple more things about Ross. He's right. I mean, Ross wrote this book, and it is a wonderful book. It should be republished. You can hardly find it. And he says in there, after the House managers presented their case, the Republicans caucused, and many of the Republican senators, including John Sherman, who eventually voted to convict, said, Stanton is not covered by the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act envisioned covering people appointed by a president and for 1 month after that president left office. Now that meant Lincoln in the case of Stanton, and so Stanton was not covered by the Tenure of Office Act. And that was the problem that the Republicans could never get over. And that's basically why I think Ross voted for acquittal. Ross was a radical himself, and I don't think he much approved of Johnson's policies, but he couldn't see convicting him of a crime when the man was not covered by the law.
But in fact, the Supreme Court eventually agreed with the view that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional.
Well, the Supreme Court in the 1920s, 60 years or 50 years after this, did give a decision in which they said gratuitously, because that law had been repealed 40 years before, they said gratuitously they thought that the Tenure of Office Act had been unconstitutional. About 10 years after that, the Supreme Court issued another opinion in which they sustained a law that is very similar to the Tenure of Office Act. So there's no way to know whether the Tenure of Office Act was constitutional or not based on what the Supreme Court says. There are good arguments about it. The impeachment itself, to convict President Johnson on the impeachment, one of the charges was that he removed Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and many senators felt, as Mr. Ross did, Senator Ross did, that the law didn't cover him. He was also charged with appointing the replacement of Stanton, however, at a time when the Senate was in session. And the Constitution says that you cannot appoint somebody without confirmation. And so people like John Sherman, who said made it clear they were going to vote to acquit Johnson on the counts of the impeachment that only specified the Stanton removal, they were going to vote to convict him for appointing Stanton's replacement improperly.
Greenville is on Interstate 81. If you ever traveled around this part of the country, just a little bit off the interstate, and a little bit farther north from us, you see the signs for the oldest town in Tennessee. It's called Jonesboro, and that's where our next call is from. Caller, you're on the air. Welcome.
Good morning and welcome to Tennessee. We certainly do appreciate C-SPAN, and especially the fact that the organization would send one of its nicer-looking members rather than Mr. Lamb down to Tennessee. We certainly rather have.
Thanks. I'm going to get in trouble for that one.
Well, we certainly hope so. I hope that someone will tell him. I thought that it might be of some small interest to you and your distinguished guests to know that there was a little bit more depth, perhaps, and a little bit more of a problem in East Tennessee, brother against brother, family members against family members, as the great crisis unfolded, if you will. And it's almost as though the personalities change and develop considerably. Andrew Johnson was run out of Jonesboro one day for his abolitionist stance. He and Judge Thomas Nelson, who was the congressman who was not seated from the 1st District that Dr. Orr talked about, were chased from Jonesboro by pro-Southern elements for their abolitionist stance. And that's kind of an interesting parallel to the items that we're discussing this morning about President Johnson may or may not have had it in his heart to be against slavery or determined enough against slavery. I think it's appropriate to keep in mind that these people were politicians, and their thoughts may have developed and changed over time. I think it's also appropriate to remember that the divisions were very, very strong, and right in East Tennessee, probably as strong as any place in the Union. The dividing line sometimes went right down the middle of families and right down the middle of towns, and I just thought it would be nice to be mindful that it's not always as simple as black and white. There's sometimes a little bit of gray in there.
Thank you very much for your call from this part of Tennessee, adding your perspective. Well, Dr. Orr, that caller essentially agrees with some of the views you put on the table. So let me just turn very briefly to Dr. Benedict for a quick response to him about history being more gray than black and white.
Well, I think we love to hear that. Historians always think of history, and not only that, but the present, as being much more gray than it is black and white. For example, what does it mean to be an abolitionist, and how do you understand what people mean by that? You have to look carefully at the context of a statement. When exactly was it? Was it at the time when President Johnson had become an abolitionist by 1863? Was it earlier? I think the gentleman who called is referring to an earlier time. When did people use the term? If it was, as I think it was, right during that terrible secession crisis when Johnson is desperately going around the state trying to keep the state into the Union, the people who opposed him called everybody who was trying to sustain the Union at that point an abolitionist, because abolitionism was tremendously unpopular in Tennessee. Nobody really believed in it. At most, if Dr. Orr is right, people talked about a long, distant time when there might be abolition. So this is a charge. And of course, Johnson denied it, and he denied it all the time. But in the heat of that terrible spring, he was almost lynched for being an abolitionist.
Dr. Robert Orr, we're going to be saying goodbye to you in the next couple minutes here. I want to ask you in closing to summarize what you would like people, if they can only know a thing or two about Andrew Johnson. What's the main message you'd like to have them carry away?
Well, I think that the main thing that I would hope for in the future is that there be a continuing study of Johnson and a revision of his of the interpretation of his life, incorporating some of these things, such as his attempted appointment of Frederick Douglass, his appointment of U.S. Grant, his appointment of Lorenzo Thomas. Those are three fine men with excellent civil rights records, and that needs to be dealt with. You can't ignore those issues. And I think that his early career as an emancipationist, granted it was gradual emancipation he wanted, and granted he wanted it with colonization. These are things that don't appeal to us today, but I think that what he actually thought should be incorporated into what I hope will be a revision of his biography in the future.
Thank you very much for adding to our understanding with all of your scholarship on Andrew Johnson. Appreciate you being here this morning.
Thank you.
Right now we're going to talk by telephone from Bedford, New Hampshire with Corinne Knoll. And as we do, we're going to look around this house which belonged to Andrew Johnson and Eliza Johnson because Corinne Knoll is a descendant of the president. Thank you, Ms. Knoll, for joining us this morning. What are your particular family stories you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, my grandmother grew up in the homestead, which you are going to be touring now. Her mother died when she was 3 years old, and she was raised by her grandmother, who was Martha Johnson Patterson, and who was the lady who served as first lady in the White House for Andrew, since his wife was an invalid. Martha Patterson was immensely proud of her father, and translated that to my grandmother, and who in turn passed it on to her grandchildren. We have always been instructed that Johnson performed a great service for our country, that he maintained the Union at a time of great peril, and that he has always been misunderstood by history. I'm very pleased to see this show today and to see that his story is being fleshed out with good and true study, and that the American public can get to hear more about the advantages that he brought to this country.
Andrew and Eliza Johnson had 5 children, as you've explained. Earlier in our program, we had a call from descendants of William Johnson, Andrew's brother, and her question was, are there any surviving family members in your part of the family that still have the Johnson last name?
No, none with the Johnson last name. The remaining survivors of Johnson all come down through Martha Patterson, through to my grandmother, who had 2 children And there are 3 on my side of the family, and then I have, I believe, 6 first cousins, or from my first cousin.
Did you ever live in Tennessee?
No, I never lived in Tennessee. I've had the great fortune of visiting there. I cut the ribbons to make the homestead a national monument back in, the 50s, I believe it was. And I've recently been down there several times with my daughter. It is a marvelous town, and the Historical Society's National Historic Association has done a wonderful job there. The sites are very well and kept and quite complete in their story of him.
How about last year for you, when people knew that you were a descendant of the first president to be impeached? Were you called upon by members of the news media to talk about last year's events?
Yes, I was. I did pass off most of them to my brother, Tom, who was fortunate enough to be able to handle it all. I was too busy. But there was a great deal of interest by the press in Johnson and what our feeling was about the impeachment. And we felt that while they were very different in nature, that they were both quite politically oriented.
Do you think that last year's events changed people's perception of your ancestor?
Yes, I think finally people have taken a much more accurate view of Johnson and his contributions, whereas I think previously people had thought that he had done a disservice to this country. I think people have come to realize that he, in fact, performed a great service for the country.
As we've toured the homestead here, we've been able to show viewers a number of the artifacts from your family history, which are now part of the Park Service collection. Furniture, paintings, some early photographs. Do you have any such items in your family that are personal family heirlooms that you can tell us about?
No, not really. Most of what we had, what has been given to the homestead. My grandmother had a lot of furniture from her childhood that she then donated back to the homestead at the time that they put that restoration together. And she was instrumental in helping to pick out things like the wallpaper and the placement of things and how the grounds were, since she had lived there soon after he had.
Thank you. I'm going to say goodbye at this point. We have only 20 minutes left. It's amazing how quickly 2.5 hours go by for us with all the information we hope to pass along. But thank you for adding your family's personal perspective on Andrew Johnson to our discussion this morning.
Thank you very much for doing the show.
Corinne Knoll is Andrew Johnson's great-great-great-granddaughter, descendant of Martha, the daughter who served as First Lady held the official duties as First Lady during the Johnson administration because of Eliza Johnson's illness from consumption or tuberculosis, as it was known at the time. We have about 20 minutes left, as I said, and Les Benedict is with us for those final 20 minutes, and we want to get in as many calls as we can for this conversation on Andrew Johnson. But let's move to the election of 1868. Johnson wanted to be elected president in his own right.
He absolutely did, and he had wanted to be elected president in his own right from the moment he became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He understood the nature of our society at that time. And public policy in those days was in many ways more connected in a way to politics than it is today. He presented and he wanted political parties to present clear alternatives to the American people, and then the American people would decide. He had absolute confidence in the American people. He was absolutely certain that he was right about what should be done in Reconstruction and about the nature of the country that should come out of Reconstruction. And he thought that the appropriate way to give the American people the choice and the appropriate way to run politics was to renominate the man who stood for the issues, and that meant him.
And why did he not get the nomination?
Well, Johnson did not actually coalesce with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, Susan, in the course of his Reconstruction. He really tried to create a middle ground that would support him because he was doing the right thing, And the consequence was that the Democrats were not too happy with him. They thought that he would have been much more successful politically if he would have used all the powers of his presidency to support their party, work with them, help them win elections in between 1865, when he became president, and 1868, so that they'd be ready to take the presidency in 1868. And he didn't do that, and he turned out not to be very effectual in those years politically, and they decided not to nominate him.
Who were the candidates in the 1868 election?
In the 1868 election, the Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant, the great general, and the Democrats nominated the former governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, very highly respected man, very reliable on a lot of issues. They nominated with him as his vice presidential candidate a Ohioan who represented all the Midwestern kinds of views on money and everything like that. And it was not an election they ran on personality. They hoped that their take on the issues would overcome Grant's great popularity.
Glendora, California, your question on Andrew Johnson.
Yes, I'm Paul Connolly. I belong to the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, and one of our patron saints is Schuyler Colfax, who was the Speaker of the House and one of the first radical Republicans. My question is, what was the relationship between the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, and Andrew Johnson? And the vice presidential candidate and the vice president under Ulysses S. Grant was Schuyler Colfax. Thank you very much.
Well, you're right. I don't think that there's much evidence of any specific relationship between Colfax and Johnson that was different than the general Republican relationship. When the Congress first met in December of 1865 and early 1866, like most Republicans, Schuyler Colfax wanted to cooperate with Andrew Johnson, and they tried to work out some basis of an agreement between the president and Congress. When it didn't work out, Colfax very strongly supported the Republican Party. There is a kind of interesting parallel between Colfax and Johnson. Johnson was a very active Mason. And in fact, when he died, his funeral here in Greenville was taken care of by the local Masons, who put on a very spectacular funeral appropriate to a man of Johnson's stature and how much he was beloved in this area.
San Jose, California.
Yes, hi. I've got 2 points concerning the rift of Johnson with Congress. First of all, that he vetoed the very first civil rights bill which was introduced, and part of his, it seemed like he was a strong supporter of Lincoln's policies, but actually he was leaning more towards a Southern position with his attending of the Douglas Cornerstone laying, which created a strong rift with Congress and irritated them. He also, I'm a little bit nervous here, was strongly in favor of civil forms of government being set up in the states which were not accepted back into the Union yet, the seceded states. It was until 1868, 3 years after the Civil War. A lot of people think the Civil War was over, but actually it was 3 years later before we became a union again, and establishing the governments and so forth. Johnson fought Congress. He said the civil form of government should be set up. Congress wanted to set up military law in these areas, and that's why when he didn't follow Congress's orders, there was a constitutional question and so forth with the Johnson refused to enforce the military law, and
Thank you, sir. I'm going to let you go because you've added a number of facts to our discussion here. Any that you'd like to react to?
Yes, the Republicans were divided about how to handle Reconstruction. Johnson had taken the initiative by organizing the southern states and restoring civil governments to them while Congress was not in session. When they came back, there were Republicans, but it turned out to be a minority of them who wanted to overturn everything Johnson had done and start anew, either with new civil governments or with military occupation. But the majority of them felt that that was impossible, that the American people would never sustain them now that their own president had gone in the other direction. So the Republicans really offered Johnson and the South a deal. The Republicans passed the Civil Rights Act. The Republicans passed the Freedmen's Bureau bill to try to help the transition from slavery to freedom. And then they passed the 14th Amendment. They proposed it. Congress had to pass it by 2/3 majority, which declared African Americans to be citizens and gave them basic rights and did a few other things. If the South and Johnson would agree to support the 14th Amendment by ratifying it, the Republicans in Congress said, we'll then restore the representation of all these governments that Johnson set up to Congress, and that will be the deal. Johnson told the South, absolutely not. Do not ratify the 14th Amendment. And of course, he vetoed the 2 other bills. And that's what caused the division. Only when the Southerners refused to go along with that deal did the Republicans in Congress finally vote to put them under a military occupation, very reluctantly.
If you would like to get the telephone number for C-SPAN in the classroom for educators for the free teaching materials, get your pencil ready. After our next telephone call, we'll give it to you once again so you can write it down, telephone number and email address. Since we're getting close to the end, I have a few thank yous I want to mix into our final 15 minutes or so here. First of all, Mark Farkas and Marty Dominguez are the co-leaders of our American Presidents series for this full year. Our stop here is being produced by Maura Pierce, one of the 3 producers, team of producers working on this series. And our director today, Gary Allenwood, longtime C-SPANner and the person responsible for all of our field crew productions. He's here on location with us, putting this pictures out. Michelle Baylor is on audio this morning. And also Tom Aldridge, our production chief, making sure that all of us are in line and all the equipment's working well. Let's take our next telephone call. It's from Ahoskie, North Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. Are you there?
We can hear you just fine, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm a white male, 57 years old, lived in Virginia, North Carolina all my life. And this is kind of a less than half-hearted defense of President Johnson, mainly because, well, I'm a historian, and I'm writing a book on Nat Turner revolt that your historians may know about. But I don't see that much change from the time of Mr. Johnson's presidency to now, when we're getting ready to enter the 21st century, i.e. our famous or infamous Senator Mr. Helms from North Carolina, who has defeated a black man twice, primarily on the race issue. And, of course, the notorious Strom Thurmond in South Carolina. And I just don't believe that things have changed that drastically over the years. So I can see his dilemma that he had to deal with, the same dilemma that we are still dealing with in the South, all over the South, and basically all over the country.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your telephone call. Let's find out, you've written a book about Reconstruction in the South. You want to comment on whether or not the politics of race have changed in the modern South today versus that time?
Well, I really do think they have. I understand why anybody would feel like, my golly, 100 years later, more than 100, 120, 130 years later, why haven't we overcome this problem? Why do we even still have to discuss it? But the fact is, it is significantly different. It's even significantly different than it was in the South in the 1960s. One of the disagreements that Dr. Orr and I have is whether or not Andrew Johnson was a racist, and of course I believe that he was. And one has to understand the depth and the meaning of racism as it was predominant in the country at that time, and as it was strong in the South all the way to the 1960s. Racism doesn't just mean racial prejudice. We have a lot of racial prejudice now. We have a lot of prejudice towards all sorts of people who are different from us. It's something that we ought to try to conquer, and it's something we ought to try to defeat. Racism is a whole philosophy that says that a whole group of people are fundamentally different inherently from the rest of us and can never jump over that gulf. And that requires us to treat them completely different and to exclude them from our society That is something that was still said in the South in the 1960s. It was something that Johnson had to deal with, and he believed in himself, I'm afraid, I think, in the 1860s. And I actually don't think, I think it's one of the heartening things, that even Strom Thurmond now, or Senator Helms, would say that kind of thing. What people talk about now is getting rid of affirmative action, getting rid of things that try to make up for whatever the bad things that happened in the past were. You find very few people articulating pure racism. The ones who do are people on the far right, in the militias, the people who've engaged in violence, who all of us fear and are so concerned about.
I promised you some addresses and phone numbers, so let's give those out to you. First of all, C-SPAN in the classroom. Again, we have free teaching materials available for you if you are a classroom teacher. Here's how you get them. You talk to our colleagues at C-SPAN at this phone number, 202-628-4858, 202-626-4858, or you can email us at cspan.org/classroom, cspan.org/classroom. Also try to answer your questions about upcoming parts of the series and some of the history questions as well. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Andrew Johnson in particular, you can talk to the folks here at the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site or look on the internet for materials they've collected. The phone number, 423-639-3711, 423-639-3711. That'll put you in touch with the National Park Service staff here. They have a full collection of books in print about Andrew Johnson and about the presidency, and including this one, which is one of the ones that we saw in the bookstore here. And I hope they're carrying yours as well. We'll hold yours up, Les Benedict, which is the impeachment and trial of Andrew Johnson. So you can buy books about the 17th president and also get pamphlets and other information. Now, if you'd like to do this on the web, they've got a website that is interactive. And here's the web address for the Andrew Johnson website, www.nps.gov/ANJO, A-N-J-O. National Park Service, www.nps.gov/ANJO, A-N-J-O. Got a sense of humor here at the Park Service. And we'll try and give you that address one more time before we finish up here. We have about 10 more minutes left. Let's take a telephone call. As we do, we'll look at some scenes from Greenville, the town that gave birth to Andrew Johnson's political career. Our call is from Midland, Texas.
Morning.
Good morning.
Once again, I want to applaud C-SPAN. You're doing a great job, and this program should have aired 10 or 20 years ago. My question deals with the Edwin Stanton papers. Back in '80, a person wrote a book called The Lincoln Conspiracy, where they found in the descendant of Edwin Stanton's 12 papers that had been torn out of John Wilkes Booth's diary that implicated Stanton, and I just wondered if anybody had researched that anymore, and maybe that was one of the reasons that Andrew Johnson thought maybe Edwin Stanton had something to do with the assassination and fired him for it. I am a first-time caller, and once again, C-SPAN, you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Sir. Edwin Stanton, why don't you hold that? Our time's running out quickly. Take a note. We'll come back to Edwin Stanton, and we'll take one more telephone call. It's from Pueblo, Colorado. Pueblo, go ahead, please.
Good morning. I have read that President Johnson had two daughters. Apparently, one of them was the great-great-grandmother of the lady that spoke a little while ago. And also, when he left the White House, that he bought for each of his two daughters a Steinway square grand piano. I just wondered if there is a musical tradition at all in the Johnson family.
Well, thank you. That Steinway piano, one of them is in the parlor here, and I'm not sure if we've still got a camera available up there to show you, but we did show it earlier. It's still part of the collection here by the National Park Service. So there was some music, at least at the time, and I bet you can't tell whether or not that continued through the generations.
Well, I certainly don't know if it was if there was a long-term musical interest. I've never seen any actual allusion to President Johnson himself playing the piano, like President Truman did, of course. And I don't even know, because it's not in the major biographies of him, about his daughters. But both of his daughters did go to girls' schools. And I think it's quite possible that that piano that you see on your screen right now was played by his daughters in the way that so many accomplished young ladies would have played piano. And you can only imagine what that would have meant to Andrew Johnson, this young guy who grew up in poverty, who had been an apprentice tailor, to be able to give the kind of education to his daughters that would have enabled them to do all the things that a lady would do in society.
Time's evaporating. 30 seconds on Edwin Stanton, please.
Edwin Stanton, there's just no evidence whatsoever. It is absurd that he was involved in the assassination. It's a kind of charge that grew up at some point, that comes up time and again. Historians investigated, disprove it time and again, but it continues to persist. No doubt at all that Andrew Johnson had no idea in the world of anything like that when he removed Stanton.
Our local affiliate here in Greenville, South Carolina is Frontier Vision, and we thank them for hosting us on our stop. Also thanks to the folks at Time Warner in Raleigh for their assistance in gathering the videotape of Andrew Johnson's early years. He was born in that area. We have just a couple of seconds left on it. We should spend it on his death. He lost the chance for a nomination, came back to Greenville, South Carolina. Was he a bitter man? What do you know about the circumstance of his final year?
Well, he wanted desperately to be vindicated by being returned to Washington, into the United States Senate, and he worked for 6 years here in Tennessee to do that. He almost got back in 1869 immediately, just lost because Democrats didn't want him to go, the old Confederates. Finally, in 1875, he is elected back to the Senate, and it's a tremendous triumph. People are cheering, bells are ringing in Greenville. His family comes and rushes and greets him. A tremendous victory. Everybody observes it, noticed it. Front page headlines all over the United States and all the newspapers. A great vindication for him.
He apparently did not attend the Grant inauguration.
No, he was so angry with Grant. Grant called him a liar. He called Grant a liar. Both of these people were sensitive people, and they hated each other afterwards.
And how did Andrew Johnson die?
Andrew Johnson, after that wonderful experience in the Senate, returned to Tennessee, stopped to visit his daughter in Carter's Station, and simply collapsed suddenly. Died quickly in a matter of hours without feeling pain as far as we can tell, having been vindicated in the way that he was. If he had to go, this was the way to go.
Did he ever get to the Senate floor to debate?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. He got back to the Senate floor, and he made one great speech, and it was a tremendous blast at Ulysses S. Grant, the president.
And Ulysses S. Grant will be our next stop, the new president, number 18, and we'll be visiting his gravesite in New York City on Monday as our look at the American presidents continues. That's live at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, we have some thank yous to do as we close here. First of all, Les Benedict, thanks for spending 2.5 hours with us and adding your scholarship to our knowledge of the president and the whole time of Reconstruction. Also, thanks to Jim Small of the National Park Service for his experience and knowledge about the life and times of Andrew Johnson. Mark Corey, who is the superintendent here of the Johnston National Historic Site, Elaine and Kendra, part of the National Park Service staff, who have helped us so much at our setup, and others here. Corinne Knoll joining us by telephone, as well as teacher Dean Small, all helping us to learn more about Andrew Johnson, and to Robert Orr, our local historian, all added to our collective works, as did your telephone calls. We thank you for being with us, and we will close now at this point after 2.5 hours live from the National Park Service Andrew Johnson National Historic Site.